From the observation deck, the world looked orderly. Small cars moved along neat grid lines, and the houses in the valley below were tidy squares of muted color. A crane, impossibly slender from this height, was lifting the last triangular pane of glass into place. Below, a small crowd had gathered on the gravel road. News vans were there, neighbors they didn't know, and a few they did. Frank's hand found Helen's, his palm rough and familiar against her own. His knuckles were swollen, his grip still strong. For 54 years, that hand had been her anchor. It had built their first bookshelf, held their children, and wiped her tears. Now, it was gripping hers as they watched the final piece of their impossible new home being set into a frame of welded steel, 150 feet in the air. Everyone had laughed. They laughed at the county auction when their names were called. They laughed when the flatbed truck delivered the first load of salvaged lumber to the rusted, forgotten monolith on the edge of town. Their own son had laughed, a short, cruel bark of a sound over the phone. "A water tower? Are you serious? What are you trying to prove?" he had asked. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were just trying to survive. Frank squeezed her hand. The glass panel slotted into place, a perfect fit. The workmen on the scaffolding gave a thumbs up. Down below, the small crowd broke into applause. It was a strange, distant sound carried on the wind. Helen looked at Frank. The lines around his eyes were deeper than they were a year ago, but the eyes themselves were clear. They held the same quiet determination she'd seen when he was 20 years old, promising her he'd build them a life. He had, and when that life was stolen, he simply started building another. This one was just taller and made of steel. But to understand how they ended up here, listening to the applause of strangers from the top of a structure everyone had called a scrap heap, you have to go back. You have to go back to a small, tidy house with a rose garden, a worn-out armchair, and the day their world was dismantled, not by a storm or a fire, but with a pen and a smile. The house on Elm Street had been their entire world for 50 years. Frank had laid the flagstone path to the front door himself, the summer of 1973. Helen had planted the rose bushes, the ones that now climbed the trellis he'd built, their thorns thick as his thumb. Inside, every scuff on the hardwood floor, every chip in the porcelain sink was a memory. It was the house where they had raised 2 children, Mark and Sarah. It was the house where they had celebrated birthdays and mourned losses. It was paid for, every last cent. It was their fortress, their legacy, the one tangible thing they had carved out a lifetime of hard work. Frank, a carpenter by trade, and Helen, a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm until she retired. They had lived a careful life, a sensible life. Mark visited on a Tuesday. He brought pastries from a fancy bakery downtown and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His wife, Susan, was with him, wearing a suit that probably cost more than their monthly grocery bill. They sat in the living room, on the couch Frank and Helen had bought with their first real savings. The air filled with the awkward, stilted conversation that had become the norm with their son. He talked about the market, about his latest investment, about the importance of leveraging assets. Helen didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the same tone a doctor used before delivering bad news. "Mom, Dad," Mark began, leaning forward, placing his polished shoes carefully on the rug Helen had braided. "We've been worried about you, about your financial security." Frank grunted. "We're fine, Mark. House is paid for. Pension is steady. But it could be better," Susan chimed in, her voice smooth and persuasive. "You're sitting on a huge asset here. This house. It's not working for you." Helen watched her son. He had Frank's hands, but not his stillness. Mark was always moving, tapping his foot, checking his phone. He was a man perpetually chasing something, and Helen had long ago stopped understanding what it was. He laid out the plan. A reverse mortgage, he called it. A way for them to access the equity in their home without having to sell. The bank would give them a lump sum, a nest egg. They could travel. They could fix the roof. They wouldn't have to worry about a thing. He had all the paperwork. A friend of his at the bank had streamlined the process. It was a favor. All they had to do was sign. "It just protects the asset," Mark had said, sliding a pen across the coffee table. It puts the house into a trust, managed by me. It's for estate planning, to make things simpler down the line. It's the smart thing to do. Trust. That was the word that did it. They trusted their son. Frank, who could spot a warped 2x4 from 50 paces, could not spot the flaw in his own child's logic. Helen, who could find a misplaced decimal in a 10-page ledger, could not find the lie hidden in the pages of dense legal text. They saw not a contract, but their son, their boy, offering to help. They signed where he told them to sign. He and Susan had hugged them, left the pastries, and were gone before the sun set. The letter arrived 6 weeks later. It was from a law firm they didn't recognize. It was cold, official, and used words like notice to vacate and completion of sale. Helen read it 3 times. The words swam before her eyes. A sale. It wasn't a reverse mortgage. It wasn't a trust. They had signed a bill of sale. They had sold their home of 50 years to a holding company owned by their son for a fraction of its market value. The lump sum they had been promised was the insultingly low sale price. Helen called Mark. His voice was different, distant, annoyed. "It's just business, Mom," he said, the words like chips of ice. "The market is hot. It was a good opportunity. You and Dad don't need a big house like this anymore. It's a burden. I'm managing your asset, just like I said." "You lied to us, Mark," Helen said, her voice barely a whisper. The receiver felt heavy, cold. "I didn't lie. I simplified it for you. You wouldn't have understood the financials. Susan and I found a lovely senior apartment for you across town. It's much more practical. Practical. Their life, their home, their memories reduced to a practical decision." Frank took the phone from her. His voice was low, a rumble of controlled thunder. He said things Helen had never heard him say, but it was no use. The line went dead. Mark had hung up on his father. They had 30 days. 30 days to pack up 50 years of a life. Each object was a new kind of pain. The height chart penciled on the kitchen doorframe, marking the growth of 2 children. The framed photo of a young Frank in his army uniform. The quilt Helen's mother had made. They moved like ghosts through their own home, wrapping their history in newspaper and placing it in cardboard boxes. Most of it went to a storage unit. They didn't know where they were going. They just knew they couldn't stay. On the last day, a sleek car pulled up. A real estate agent in a bright red blazer stepped out, smiling a predatory smile. She was there to prepare the property for staging. Helen took one last look at her rose bushes before getting into their old, reliable sedan. Frank turned the key. The engine turned over with a familiar grumble. He didn't look back. He just drove. The first stop was a motel off the highway. The sign blinked vacancy in buzzing neon. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. The carpet was sticky. The air conditioner rattled like a box of stones. This was their new home. Helen sat on the edge of the stiff bed and opened her old bookkeeping ledger. She wrote down the date, the cost of the motel room, and their remaining balance. The numbers were stark, unforgiving. Their savings, once a comfortable cushion, now looked like a threadbare patch. Frank stood by the window, staring at the parking lot. His hands, those capable, clever hands, were jammed into his pockets. They had nothing to build, nothing to fix. Helen had never seen him so still, so lost. Days bled into weeks. They tried the senior apartment Mark had mentioned. It was a small, sterile box with beige walls and a view of a brick wall. The monthly rent was more than their old mortgage payment had been. It felt like a prison. They tried looking for other places, but deposits were high and their age worked against them. They were adrift, invisible. They spoke to a lawyer, a young man who looked at them with pity and told them it would be a long, expensive fight, a fight they couldn't afford. They called their daughter, Sarah, who lived 2 states away. She was horrified, furious with Mark, but her own life was complicated. A new baby, a husband with health problems. She sent them what little money she could spare and promised to visit, her voice choked with tears. But she couldn't fix it. The motel became their world. The drone of the highway, the thin walls, the taste of lukewarm coffee from a plastic pot. Helen watched their bank account shrink with each passing day. She calculated their burn rate. She knew, down to the penny, when the money would run out. Frank spent his days taking long walks, coming back with his face etched with a deeper weariness. They were being erased. Their past had been stolen, and their future was a blank, terrifying page. This was a low point, the quiet, desperate understanding that they had been utterly and completely discarded. One night, Helen couldn't sleep. The rattling of the air conditioner was a frantic drumbeat in her head. Frank was asleep, a deep, exhausted sleep that offered no rest. She opened her laptop, a small, cheap thing they'd bought a few years ago. She scrolled through local news, classifieds, anything to distract her from the numbers in her ledger. She typed cheap property into the search bar, a hopeless, futile gesture. And then she saw it. A listing from the county surplus auction website. The photo was grainy, taken on a gray, overcast day. It showed a single, monumental object rising from a field of overgrown weeds. A water tower, tall, cylindrical, capped with a conical roof. Its steel body was a patchwork of rust and faded paint. The description was brief. County Water Tower Number 4. Decommissioned 1988. Property sold as is, where is. Approximate 12 acres. The price was a typo. It had to be $5,000. Helen stared at the screen. It was absurd. A joke. A piece of industrial refuse. But she couldn't look away. She saw the solid steel legs. The wide, circular tank. It was ugly. It was derelict. But it was solid. It was still standing. It wasn't a beige box in a complex full of forgotten people. It was something else. An idea, so wild and desperate it felt like a jolt of electricity began to form in her mind. She looked over at Frank, at his hands, resting on the thin motel blanket, hands that knew how to build. She woke him up. "Frank," she whispered, turning the laptop towards him. "Look at this." He squinted at the screen, his face confused in the dim light. "What is it?" "A silo. A water tower," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's for sale. For $5,000. Frank stared at the picture, then at her. He thought she had finally broken. The strain had been too much. "Helen, have you lost your mind? It's a heap of scrap metal." "It's a heap of scrap metal on 1.2 acres of land, Frank," she countered, her mind racing, the bookkeeper in her already calculating. "Land that no one can take from us. We could put a trailer on it. We could build a small shed. It's a start. It's something that's ours. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's no water, no electricity. It's a shell. We've started with less," she said softly, and that stopped him. He remembered. The tiny apartment they first rented. The second-hand furniture. The single hot plate she cooked their meals on. They had built a life from nothing before. Doubt was a heavy cloak on his shoulders, but her resolve was a small, bright flame in the dark motel room. He saw the fire in her eyes, a spark he hadn't seen in months. It was the same look she'd had when she'd insisted they could afford the down payment on the Elm Street house, when everyone else said they were crazy. "We don't even know what it looks like inside," he mumbled, a last bastion of his practical nature. "Then we'll go look," she said. "I'm driving." The next morning, they checked out of the motel. They didn't know if they would be back. Helen left the key on the counter and didn't look back. They drove for an hour away from the city into the rolling, empty countryside. The directions led them down a series of smaller and smaller roads until they were on a gravel track, a cloud of dust billowing behind them. And then they saw it. The picture hadn't done it justice. It was a giant, a rusted sentinel standing guard over a field of thistle and Queen Anne's lace. It loomed over them, casting a long, skeletal shadow. The paint, once a municipal blue, had peeled away to reveal the deep orange of corrosion. Graffiti covered the thick steel legs. A ladder, missing half its rungs, climbed 100 feet up its side. It was worse than they had imagined. It was magnificent. Frank got out of the car and walked towards it, his steps slow, methodical. He was a carpenter inspecting a piece of wood, looking for its grain, its flaws, its strength. Helen watched from the car, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. Frank reached the base and placed his hand flat against one of the massive steel legs. The metal was cold, solid. He ran his palm over the pitted surface, then knocked on it with his knuckles. The sound was a deep, resonant thud. Not the thin clang of decay, but the solid sound of thick-gauge steel. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning every rivet, every seam. He found the main access hatch at the base. A heavy iron wheel rusted shut. He put his shoulder into it. Nothing. He braced himself, planting his feet, and threw his entire weight into it. The wheel groaned, a screech of metal on metal, and then, with a final shuddering pop, it turned. He pulled the heavy door open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over him. The inside was dark, cavernous. He took a flashlight from the car and stepped inside. Helen followed, her apprehension mixed with a thrilling, terrifying sense of possibility. The beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom. They were standing at the bottom of a vast, hollow cylinder. The concrete base was thick, solid. Above them, the steel walls soared into darkness. A central pillar, a massive pipe, rose through the center. Dust motes danced in the light. It smelled of rust and damp earth and time. It was empty, a blank canvas. Frank shone the light upwards along the curving walls. He saw the seams, the rows of rivets like stitching. "Good bones," he said, his voice echoing in the huge space. "It's solid." Helen looked at the floor, at the sheer, intimidating scale of the place. It was overwhelming. But then she looked at Frank. He was no longer the lost man from the motel window. His shoulders were back. His eyes were alive, scanning, measuring, planning. He was a builder again. He had found something to build. "We'll buy it," she said, her voice not echoing, but clear and certain in the vast emptiness. The county clerk was a woman with a tired face and a nameplate that read, Brenda. She looked at the cashier's check for $5,000, then at the elderly couple standing before her. "You're sure about this?" she asked, a hint of pity in her voice. "You know what you're buying, right? It's just the tower. No utilities. County's not responsible for access." "We're sure," Helen said, pushing the check forward. Brenda shrugged and stamped the paperwork with a loud, final thud. "Congratulations," I guess. She slid a key across the counter. It was a big, old-fashioned iron key for the padlock on the gate. It felt heavy in Helen's hand. It felt like ownership. Their first act as property owners was to buy a tent, a cooler, and 2 sleeping bags. They pitched the tent at the base of the tower, in a patch of weeds Frank cleared with a borrowed scythe. That night, they sat in folding chairs and ate sandwiches as the sun set, painting the rusted steel of their new home in shades of orange and purple. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets. It was a world away from the rattling air conditioner and the highway drone. "We're crazy, you know," Frank said, looking up at the dark silhouette of the tower against the starry sky. "Probably," Helen agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "But we're together, and we're home." The work began the next morning. It was monumental, Sisyphean. Frank started at the base. He needed to clear the land to create a workspace. He spent days with the scythe and a rusty axe he'd found in the pump house, cutting back decades of overgrowth. Helen organized. She made lists. She researched. She learned about zoning laws, about septic systems, about solar power. Her ledger, once a chronicle of their decline, was now filled with plans, budgets, and phone numbers. Frank's first major task was to make the tower safe. The ladder was a death trap. He spent a week fabricating new rungs from scrap metal he bought at the junkyard, carefully welding them into place. It was slow, painstaking work. Every day, he climbed a little higher, securing the path to the top. When he finally reached the catwalk that encircled the tank, he found a hatch that led inside. The tank was a different world, a vast, dark dome. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and decay. A shallow pool of foul-smelling rainwater covered the floor. But above the waterline, the steel was sound. Frank stood in the center of the immense space, the future living quarters, and saw not a filthy cistern, but a circular room with a panoramic view. He saw a home. They needed supplies, more than they could afford. Their savings were almost gone, eaten up by the purchase, the tent, the basic tools. Frank drove their old sedan into the nearest town, a small, sleepy place called Oakhaven. He walked into the local hardware store, a place that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. An old-fashioned bell chimed as he entered. Behind the counter was a man about his own age, with a shock of white hair and hands stained with grease. His name tag read Earl Hobbs Prop. Frank laid out his list on the counter. Gueldingrats, grinding wheels, Ruskambertar, primer. It was a long list. Earl looked it over, then looked at Frank. He saw the worn-out work boots, the faded jeans, the determined set of his jaw. He saw a man he understood. Working on a project? Earl asked, his voice a friendly gravel. You could say that, Frank said. Bought the old water tower out on Route 4. Earl raised an eyebrow. He'd heard the talk. The crazy old couple who'd bought the rust bucket. He dismissed it as gossip. That's a hell of a project, he said, a note of respect in his voice. Frank nodded. Need to get it sealed before winter. Earl tallied up the cost. The number was high. He saw Frank's face tighten, the small, almost imperceptible flinch. Earl had seen that look 1,000 times. Good men trying to do good work with not enough money. Earl tapped his pencil on the counter. He made a decision. Tell you what, he said, leaning forward. I'll set you up an account. You look like a man who pays his debts. Pay me what you can when you can. I'd rather see this stuff get used to build something than sit on my shelf. Frank was speechless. It was an act of trust, of kindness from a complete stranger, more profound than anything he had received from his own son. Thank you, he stammered. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Earl said, already pulling items from the shelves. Now let's talk about that rust. You want the good stuff, not that cheap junk. That act of kindness was the first stone in a new foundation. Frank drove back to the tower with a truck bed full of supplies and a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a discarded old man. He was a builder with a line of credit. He was a man with a project. He was a man with an ally. With the right materials, the work accelerated. Frank was a dervish of activity. He spent weeks on the exterior of the tank, suspended from a bosun's chair, grinding away decades of rust. The sound of the angle grinder echoed across the field from dawn until dusk. It was a sound of reclamation, of a slow and brutal rebirth. Helen would watch from the ground, her hand shielding her eyes, as the orange skin of the tower was stripped away, revealing the dull, honest gray of raw steel beneath. After the grinding came the primer, a deep red oxide that sealed the metal against the elements. Frank painted with a methodical patience, stroke by stroke, transforming the rusted hulk into a solid, monolithic column of crimson. He was not just painting a building, he was healing a wound. Inside, the first priority was to make a small section of the base livable. Winter was coming. He framed out a small room in the cavernous cylinder, insulating it heavily. He installed a small wood stove, its chimney snaking up towards the darkness above. It was cramped, just a bed, a small table, and 2 chairs, but it was warm and dry. The day they moved out of the tent and into that small, defiant room was a victory. They had built their first room in their new home. One afternoon, a beat-up car sputtered to a stop on the gravel road near their gate. A young woman got out. She was pregnant, her belly a prominent curve under a thin dress. She looked lost and frightened. Helen walked out to meet her. "Can I help you?" she asked. "My car just died," the young woman said, her voice trembling. I don't know where I am." Her name was Maria. She was running. From a boyfriend. From a life that had become a cage. She had no money, no plan, just a tank of gas that had run out at the foot of their water tower. Frank looked at the car's engine and declared a lost cause. Night was falling. "You can stay with us for the night," Helen offered, without a moment's hesitation. She saw in Maria's eyes the same desperation she had felt in the motel room, the look of someone who had been discarded. Maria stayed the night. She stayed the next day. She never left. She was quiet at first, watchful, but she saw the quiet, steady rhythm of their life. The hard work, the shared meals, the unspoken partnership between Frank and Helen. She started to help. She cooked meals on their small camp stove. She helped Helen organize supplies. She had a quick mind and a gentle spirit. She found a purpose in their impossible project. She became the first member of their new, unintentional family. The project grew. The small room at the base became a workshop. The real living space was to be in the tank, 100 feet up. The challenge was immense. How to get materials up there? How to build floors, walls, plumbing in a giant steel can. Frank's ingenuity shone. He built a winch system, powered by an old truck engine he bought for scrap. Slowly, painfully, beams of wood, sheets of plywood, and barrels of water were hoisted up to the catwalk and wrestled through the hatch. He laid a subfloor inside the tank, a massive wooden circle suspended over the curved steel bottom. The echo was gone, replaced by the solid thud of his work boots on plywood. They needed electricity. The grid was half a mile away, and the cost to connect was astronomical. Helen's research had led her to solar power. It was expensive, but it was a one-time cost. It was independence. They were saving for the panels when another stranger appeared. She drove up in a dusty pickup truck, a woman with short, gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She introduced herself as Claudia Torres. "I'm a retired electrician," she said, looking up at the tower with a critical eye. "Heard what you two were doing out here. Came to see the circus." Frank, wary of gawkers, just nodded. Claudia walked around the base, inspecting his welds, the framing of the workshop. She was silent for a long time. "Your work is good," she finally said. It was the highest form of praise. "But your wiring is a fire hazard." She pointed to the temporary generator setup. "You're going to kill yourselves." She spent the next hour sketching on a notepad, designing a proper electrical system, from solar panels on the roof to a battery bank at the base. "I'll help you," she said, seeing their hesitation. "Cost of materials only. I'm bored, and this is more interesting than fishing." Claudia became another pillar of their new community. She spent 3 days a week at the tower, running conduit, grounding wires, teaching Frank the intricacies of the electrical code. She and Earl, the hardware man, knew each other from way back. They would argue good-naturedly over the merits of different brands of circuit breakers. The tower was becoming a magnet for the lost and the capable. One day, a young man named Leo showed up. He'd heard about the project in town. He was living in his car after his family had kicked him out. He was a tech whiz, a genius with computers who couldn't hold down a regular job. He offered to help in exchange for a place to park his car where he wouldn't be hassled. Leo became their technology guru. He sourced salvaged solar panels online for a fraction of the cost. He designed a system to pump water from a well Frank had dug up to a holding tank on the roof. He even set up a satellite internet connection. He found his place, his skills valued, his presence accepted without question. Slowly, miraculously, a home was taking shape in the sky. Frank, with Leo's help, cut massive openings in the steel tank and framed in windows. For the first time, light flooded the cavernous space, revealing a breathtaking 360-degree view of the countryside. They partitioned the vast circle into rooms: a large, open-plan living area, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom. Maria helped Helen paint the new drywall. Claudia wired the outlets. Leo installed the lights. It was a community, a self-sustaining ecosystem built on shared work and mutual respect. They ate dinners together at a long table Frank built from reclaimed lumber. They were a strange, motley family, a collection of cast-offs who had found a home in a scrap heap. The tower was no longer just Frank and Helen's project. It belonged to all of them. As the structure became more livable, it also became more visible. The newly painted tower, with its gleaming windows, was a landmark. It attracted attention. And attention, they were about to learn, was a double-edged sword. The white county truck pulled up on a Monday morning. A man in a crisp shirt with a clipboard stepped out. He had the unmistakable air of a bureaucrat who enjoyed his authority. He walked to the base of the tower and stared up at it, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. "This is a private residence?" he called out. Frank came down from the workshop. "It is." The man introduced himself as Mr. Davies, from the County Planning and Zoning Department. "I need to see your permits," he said, his tone flat. Permits. In their desperate rush to build a shelter, it was a detail they had overlooked. Helen had researched zoning, but the property was in an unincorporated area with lax regulations. Or so she had thought. Mr. Davies was not impressed. He walked through the ground floor, his pen scratching furiously on his clipboard. Unapproved structural modifications, unlicensed electrical work, improper sanitation, the list went on. He didn't bother to look at the quality of the work, only at its non-compliance with a book of rules he carried in his head. He slapped a bright orange sticker on the door. It was a stop work order. "This structure is hereby condemned as an unsafe dwelling," he announced. "You have 30 days to bring it into compliance with county code, or we will have it demolished. At your expense." The words hit them like a physical blow. Demolished. After all their work. After everything they had built. Despair, the old, familiar enemy from the motel room, crept back into the edges of their lives. That night, the little community sat around the dinner table in silence. The vibrant energy that had filled the tower was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of dread. It was Claudia who broke the silence. "He's a by-the-book paper pusher," she said, stabbing a piece of potato with her fork. "The electrical is sound. It's better than code. He just needs the right paperwork from a licensed inspector. But we can't afford an inspector or an engineer to approve the structural changes," Helen said, her voice heavy. "Maybe we can," Leo said, looking up from his laptop. "I've been reading the county charter. There are provisions for agricultural and experimental structures. We might be able to get a variance." Maria, who had been quiet, spoke up. "People in town think what you're doing is amazing," she said. "They talk about it at the grocery store. The crazy tower people. But they don't say it like it's a bad thing. They say it with wonder." The spark of defiance returned. They had not come this far to be defeated by a man with a clipboard. They had built a home from nothing. They would fight for it. The next 30 days were a blur of frantic activity. They didn't stop building. They started building smarter. Leo printed out reams of county code, and they went through it line by line. Claudia called in a favor from a semi-retired structural engineer she knew. The engineer, a gruff man named Henderson, came out, expecting a disaster. He spent a whole day with Frank, inspecting every weld, every support beam. He left, shaking his head in amazement. "It's overbuilt," he told them. "Stronger than it needs to be." He drew up a set of official plans and stamped them with his seal, charging them only a token fee. Maria started a petition in town. She stood outside the grocery store with a clipboard and a picture of the tower. She told people their story. The story of a couple who had lost everything and were building a new life from scrap. The signatures piled up. Earl Hobbs put a jar on his counter at the hardware store, Tower Defense Fund. It filled up with dollar bills and loose change. The town, which at first laughed, was now rallying behind them. They worked day and night to address every single violation on Davy's list. They installed extra fire extinguishers. They labeled every circuit breaker. They filed for every possible permit and variance. During that frantic month, another car drove up their gravel road. A luxury sedan, gleaming and out of place. Mark got out. He was wearing a golf shirt and an expression of stunned disbelief. He had seen a small article in a regional paper about the Water Tower House and had driven out. His curiosity piqued. He stared up at the tower, at the new windows, the satellite dish, the solid, painted structure. This was not the heap of rust he had imagined. This was an architectural marvel. This was valuable. "My God," he breathed, walking towards them. "What have you done?" Helen met him at the gate. Frank, a silent, solid presence just behind her. Maria, Leo, and Claudia stood further back, a protective circle. "We built a home, Mark," Helen said, her voice even, devoid of the anger and pain that had once consumed her. "This is incredible," he said, his mind clearly racing, calculating. "You should sell this. We could get a fortune for it. A unique property like this, it's a gold mine. I have connections. We could list it, split the profit. It could solve all our problems. Our problems." The sheer audacity of the word hung in the air. "We don't have any problems, Mark," Helen said quietly. "And you are not we." "What are you talking about?" he sputtered. "I'm your son. This is a family asset. You gave up your place in this family when you left us in that motel," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had spoken. "This isn't an asset. It's a home, and it's not for sale." Mark looked from his parents to the small group of strangers standing behind them. He saw their faces, loyal and defiant. He saw that he was the outsider here. He had no power. The smooth, persuasive charm that had worked so well in their living room on Elm Street was useless here, against the backdrop of this monument to their resilience. "You're crazy," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You're choosing these vagrants over your own family." "They're our family," Helen said, the words simple, final. "Now, please leave our property." He stared at her, his mother, and saw not a frail old woman he could manipulate, but a stranger, strong and unyielding. He got back in his expensive car, spun the tires in the gravel, and sped away, leaving only a cloud of dust. They never saw him again. The day of the final inspection arrived. It was a bright, clear morning. Mr. Davies pulled up in his white truck, his face grim, his clipboard ready. He was expecting to sign a demolition order. Frank and Helen met him at the door. They didn't speak. They simply let him in. He started at the bottom, in the workshop. He checked the wiring. He looked at the new, clearly labeled breaker box. He saw the fire extinguishers, mounted according to code. His pen, which had been poised to check off violations, remained still. He took the newly installed spiral staircase up to the main living area. When he stepped in the light-filled circular room, he stopped dead. The sunlight was streaming through the huge windows, illuminating the polished wooden floor. The view was staggering. He looked at the kitchen, with its properly vented stove. He checked the bathroom, with its code-compliant plumbing that fed into their new, county-approved septic system. He saw the stamped engineering plans Helen had laid out on the kitchen table. He saw the signed-off electrical inspection from a licensed master electrician Claudia had called in. He saw the petition with over 500 signatures from the townspeople. He walked over to a window and looked out across the valley. He was silent for a full 5 minutes. Frank and Helen stood waiting, their hands clasped together. Their entire world hung on this man's decision. Davies turned around. He looked at them, and for the first time, he seemed to see them not as violators, but as people. He looked at the quality of the craftsmanship, the ingenuity, the sheer bloody-minded determination that it must have taken to create this place. He walked over to the door, where the orange condemnation sticker was still affixed. He reached out, took a corner, and slowly, deliberately peeled it off. He tore it into small pieces and put them in his pocket. He looked at Frank. "Your welds are better than the ones on the new county bridge," he said, a note of awe in his voice. Then he looked at Helen. "Ma'am, you submitted more paperwork than the developer for the new shopping mall." He took out his pen, clicked it, and signed the bottom of his inspection form. He checked the box marked "Approved for Occupancy." "This isn't a water tower anymore," Mr. Davies said, handing the form to Helen. "This is a home. Congratulations." He left without another word. As his truck disappeared down the road, a cheer went up from the small family gathered inside. It was over. They had won. The story of the Water Tower House became a local legend. The newspaper article Mark had seen was followed by a much larger feature story, complete with glossy photos. It told the whole story: the betrayal, the motel, the crazy idea, the community that had helped build it. The article was picked up by a national news syndicate. Suddenly, their quiet act of survival was an inspiration. The aftermath for Mark and Susan was swift. The story didn't name them, but in a small community, the details were enough. Their business dealings came under scrutiny. The story of how they had acquired their parents' house became common knowledge. They were shunned at the country club, their friends suddenly distant. The bank that had facilitated the predatory sale faced a public relations nightmare. Their carefully constructed world of respectable greed began to crumble. Justice, it turned out, sometimes came in the form of a feature article. Life at the tower settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The notoriety brought visitors, but a simple private property sign was enough to keep most at a respectful distance. They were no longer invisible. Maria had her baby, a healthy girl she named Helena. The sound of a baby's cry filled the steel walls, a sound of new life. Leo started a small, successful business repairing computers and electronics, running it out of the workshop at the base. Claudia was a permanent fixture at their dinner table, her gruff humor a vital part of their family. Earl from the hardware store would come by on Sundays, not to collect on the debt, which they had long since paid off, but to sit on the deck and watch the sunset. At the base of the tower, Helen started a garden. In the rich soil, she planted tomatoes, squash, and beans. And in a special, protected corner, she planted a single rose bush, a cutting she had secretly taken from their old garden on Elm Street on their last day. It took root. It began to grow. One day, a year after the final inspection, a small, unfamiliar car pulled up the drive. A woman got out. It was Sarah, their daughter. She looked older, tired. She had the baby with her. She had finally left her husband, found her own strength. She had driven for 2 days straight. She stood before them, tears streaming down her face. She had been told a different story by Mark, a tangled web of lies about their incompetence and his reluctant intervention. The news articles had shown her the truth. "I'm so sorry," she wept. "I should have been here. I should have helped." Helen looked at her daughter, at the grandchild she had never met. The anger and hurt had long since faded, replaced by the quiet strength of the tower. She opened her arms. Sarah fell into her embrace. There were no grand speeches of forgiveness. There was no need. Helen simply said, "The door's open, Sarah. Dinner's almost ready." Sarah and her daughter stayed. They took the second bedroom. The tower, which had been a refuge, now became a sanctuary for 3 generations of their family. The broken pieces were slowly, carefully being put back together. And so they lived. Their days were filled with the simple, profound rhythms of a life they had built themselves. The hum of Leo's computers, the gurgle of baby Helena, the scent of baking bread from the kitchen, the solid, reassuring presence of the steel walls around them. On a warm summer evening, Frank and Helen sat on the observation deck, the one with the glass panels that formed a crown on their kingdom. The sun was setting, a fiery spectacle of orange and gold. The lights in the valley below were beginning to twinkle on, including the distant, familiar lights of Elm Street. It no longer held any pain for them. It was just a place they used to live. Frank reached over and flipped a switch. A single, bright light on the very top of the tower switched on, a beacon that could be seen for miles. He had installed it last week. A permanent light. He took her hand, the same rough, strong hand that had found hers on this very deck when the last piece of glass was put in place. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day end and the night begin. "It's on," he said, his voice content. Helen leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the world they had made. "So they know we're home," she replied. And in the quiet peace of that high place, surrounded by the family they had found and the family they had reclaimed, they were finally completely home. The light shone steadily in the gathering darkness, a small, defiant star they had placed in the sky themselves.